It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker of today, Professor Olivier Collignon from the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium. Olivier did his PhD at the Université Catholique de Louvain originally, and then he did a postdoc in Montreal. And after that, he obtained a principal investigator position at the Center for Mind-Brain Science at the University of Trento in Italy. Shortly after that, he received a prestigious ERC starting grant, and he returned to the Université Catholique de Louvain, where he is now, but he still has an affiliation in Trento, as far as I understood. His research is concerned with the mechanisms underlying cross-modal perception and plasticity. Olivier's research is driven by the strong conviction that the study of sensory deprived individuals represents an excellent model to probe how the brain develops, maintains, and changes its functional tuning to adapt to the environment. Olivier was among the first to have had the idea that cross-modal reorganization in blind people is constrained by the original computational functions of the visual deprived occipital regions. So in this vein, the title of his talk will be Brain Reorganization and Sensory Deprivation, Recycling the Multisensory Scaffolding of Functional Brain Networks. We're really excited to have you, Olivier, so please, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Petra, for organizing this, for inviting me. It's really a fantastic series. So yeah, thank you very much for that. I'll start by sharing my screen. Do you see it full screen? Perfect. So yeah, again, thank you. And I like to, so there is something not working. Okay. So I like to start my talk by, showing this fantastic picture of Raffaello. It's actually the School of Athens. You can find this painting actually in the Raffaello room in the Vatican. And there is lots of prominent scholars on this painting. But mostly in the center of this painting, you could actually see older Plato speaking with Aristotle. And, it is already known that these two scholars were at that time debating what is potentially one of the most pervasive and kind of important question in the field of cognitive science. What is the nature of knowledge and how is it implemented in the human mind and brains? With here Plato pointing toward the sky, finger suggesting that we have innate knowledge that comes from above, and Aristotle putting his hand toward the ground, suggesting that we need to sense somehow our environment to create a representation, a knowledge of the world that surrounds us. Obviously, this question has been, like I said, very pervasive, right? So if you think about the Enlightenment period and people like Descartes or Kant really strongly believing in innatist structure of the mind and brain versus John Locke or Hume or Berkeley, believing that we are born like tabula rasa, right? Like a blank slate. And up to now, probably some among the most interesting questions or mostly debated question in cognitive science about the fact that are we born with a universal grammar in our mind are still really the kind of questions we are asking, right? If we translate these questions in more cognitive neuroscience terms, the question is how much of the brain is actually dependent on experience versus innate knowledge to develop its functional tuning towards some specific sensory or cognitive operation. And we actually know that nature is in the place, right? We know that we inherit a brain from evolution, and from as far as we can trace it back in our common ancestors or cousin, there is a division of computational labor in brain regions that is at least divided to process differently in the brain the different sensory input we capture from the environment, for example, right? And if we zoom in one of these systems, for example, vision, we know that there is also an organization, very precise organization, hierarchical way of processing information from the primary sensory visual cortex that is tuned, that has very small receptive fields tuned, for example, to spatial frequencies or orientation. And progressively along the visual pathway, we will have larger receptive fields that start to be tuned to more like abstract categories, like, for example, being living or non-living, right? And yeah, what is interesting actually is that this organization seems to be there very early on, right? If you probe the brain of a young kitten at P14, so basically when the kittens start to open the eyes, what you see is that there is already, the primary visual cortex of this kitten is already organized. This patchy, colorful organization that you see here is the columnar organization for orientation that seemed to be already there at P14, where no visual experience was there in the brain of this kitten. And what you see is that this organization refined with time. Actually, it seems to be the case also for more high-level features or more high-level categories, like, for example, faces, right? We know in adults that we have face-selective patches, but it seems that after only few hours after birth, the babies, the newborns, are already attracted more by face-like stimuli compared to non-face-like stimuli, and that the occipital cortex react more toward these face-like stimuli compared to these inverted face-like or control stimuli. And at 4 to 6 months of age, actually, the brain is already tuned to faces even when they are presented in such a complex stream or complex visual objects, right? So it's there early on and it refines very quickly with experience. I've said that nature is in the place, but obviously nurture is also in the place. We know it, right? Actually, probably one of the best way to probe this is to deprive the system, the brain, from its natural input, right? So if we look at this map I've showed you before about like orientation for columns for orientations, that is there very early on. Actually, it's also the case in dark-reared cats. It's not surprising, actually, it's there because it's comparable at P14. It's also there at P26, even if these cats are raised in the dark. But if you let them develop in complete darkness, these maps vanish away, right? So you need experience to maintain and refine these maps. And this is true also for faces, like I've said. For example, the group of Livingstone have demonstrated that if you never see a face, right, you don't develop or you don't maintain actually these face selective patches in here, the macaque brain. So what's happening in there, right? So if these regions, they do not receive their sensory input, the maps, the visual maps that is innately there in these regions seems to disappear. What does replace it? If the sensory deprivation is complete, what is typically happening here, it's a contrast between here consciously blind people born blind and sighted subject when they process sounds. Here it's not important which type of sounds they process. What you see is that obviously the auditory cortex is activated, the motor cortex also, it was the task involved motor response. But what you see is that in the blind group, you have now a massive enhancement in the reactivity of the occipital cortex for sound processing. If you contrast these two groups and you ask statistically what is more activated in the brain of a blind subject, consciously blind subject versus sighted subject, you have this massive, extremely significant, and also extremely reliable across studies, activity observable for the processing of non-visual input. So it's a, typically we call that cross-modal plasticity. And the goal of the research we are doing now, at least in several labs, but including my lab, is to try to understand like how this cross-modal plasticity expresses, right? So this is true for blindness. I've shown, I will show you also some examples of, that are very similar in case of deafness. And here actually it's already like somehow like describing what is the end of my talk. What I've tried to convince you about is that the expression of this cross-modal plasticity relates to the way multisensory brain networks are shaped, right? and to the idea that regions across different sensory systems that are involved in the same type of computation, right, resolving the same problem, are intrinsically linked, and that this link is innate, and this link represents the scaffolding on which cross-modal plasticity will be built, right? So that this scaffolding that we see here in this schema will actually constrain the expression of cross-modal plasticity. So let's start with the first example. So here is a perceptual ability that is extremely important for the survival of organisms. That's always been the case. It's still the case for people that live in cities, processing the direction of motion, right? If you want to survive in your environment, you need to be able to do that. You see here, it's a visual representation of this perceptual ability, but in daily life, we typically encounter this problem in a multisensory fashion. And the way it is typically conceived, at least in neuroscience textbook, is that this information will be captured and transferred to selective sensory brain regions that will then selectively and functionally process this moving information. Obviously, what the field of multisensory integration has brought on the table is that obviously this needs to be integrated, right? Because these two inputs are present in a spatio-temporal congruent fashion, therefore brain networks will interact to integrate these two multisensory inputs. And there are like tremendous work about that. And what we have been interested lately is to look more specifically in one of these regions that is known, very well known to process visual motion information, which is V5, asking the question, will it be possible to find trace of cross-modal input in these regions that is classically considered as purely visual region, right? So how do we do that? Actually, it's a pretty simple setup that we use. We present what we call random dot kinematograms moving in different directions to the participants. And then we try to reproduce that in audition. In audition, it's actually more tricky, right? Because here we mostly rely on fMRI, and creating a vivid and ecological representation of auditory motion in the scanner is complex. So the trick we use that you see in this video is that we insert miniature microphones inside the ear of each of our participants, facing our auditory apparatus composed of 64 speakers, and we create by opening and closing in succession these different speakers, different auditory directions that mimic the directions that we use in vision. And we reproduce these sounds that have been recorded inside the ear of these participants. This is particularly important if you want to create directional motion on the vertical axis, because this relies on spectral cues, and spectral cues are body specific, right? It depends on the shape of your pinea, the shape of your head, the shape of your torso. So in the first experiment, what we did is we used what we call a big block design, very simple experiment. We present these different directions of motion in a block, and we contrast these blocks with static events, or static dots that move, right, from time to time, but they are not producing coherent motion. And we do that in vision and in audition. We contrast visual motion and visual static together, and auditory motion and auditory static, and we isolate the regions that are therefore selective to visual and auditory motion. So what we see is, as we could have expected, we have HMT plus V5 selective for visual motion. We have the human planum temporale, which is highly selective to auditory motion. And then interestingly enough, we find regions just anterior to V5 that are selective to auditory motion only, and zones of overlap, right? And in the anterior portion of V5, we find this region that is selective to auditory motion and visual motion. Now what we can do is, instead of working at the group level, as I'm doing here right now, we isolate in each subject functionally the regions that selectively react to auditory and visual motion, And then now we will work in individual space to have individually localized auditory and visual motion clusters, so therefore functionally defined in each individual, right? So we now do a second experiment where the simple trick we use here is just to separate the events, right? So it's the same type of stimulation as before, but the events, they are presented separately, therefore making this experiment suitable for a decoding experiment, so using multivariate pattern analysis. So, and when we decode here the direction of motion, so what I should have probably said is that if you look at the univariate level, so the activity level in each voxel, you cannot distinguish voxels that prefer direction. When you actually look at the distributed pattern of activity, as we do with MVPA, and here MVP decoding here, using, for example, support vector machine, we like we see it here, decode direction of motion more than chance. If we have 4 directions, chance level is 25. We see that we can do it in vision, right, in V5. This is expected, but interestingly enough, in the right V5, we can decode the direction of motion also in the auditory domain, right? So here, the right V5 seems to have information about the direction of motion, right, in both vision and audition. And the question we ask next is it possible that this region contain a representation of directional motion that is somehow common across the senses, somehow abstracted from the modality of input? And how do we probe that? We just train the decoder, the algorithm, on one modality and decode in the other modality, right? What's called typically cross-modal decoding. And if we can successfully do it, it means that there is a common representation about motion direction across the senses. And when we do it in the right V5, indeed, we can successfully obtain cross-modal decoding. When we do a searchlight around the brain, so we probe all the brain. This is actually the only regions where we have this significant cross-modal decoding, and this region again fall into what is here outlined here, a visually defined V5. Okay, so it seems that there is information about directional motion that is somehow sharing commonalities across the senses. Does that mean, am I suggesting here that V5 is actually an abstract region processing auditory and visual information in an abstractly common fashion? No, right? If I take the information from my voxels in V5 and just simplify here this multidimensional information just in 2 dimensions here using multidimensional scaling, just for visualization purpose here, what we see is that the first striking axis of representation information separate the 2 modalities, right? We see that actually it's very easy from the information that we have from V5 to separate these 2 modalities. That being said, the second dimension that we can probe in this region is an axis of motion that is common between both modalities. So even though this brain region does not react perfectly similarly for the 2 modalities, it shares a representational space that is common, and this is this shared representational space here, axis of motion, that likely allow cross-modal decoding. If you go in the paper of Mohammed that has been published last year, we do a lot of complementary analysis to explain better this multi-phased representation of motion direction in V5. So what we have seen is that there is auditory motion information in V5 in sighted subjects, right? Where this information comes from? Obviously, this can come from top-down input from parietal cortex, and this is very likely the case. But what we wanted to probe is the possibility of having also in parallel a more direct connection between the planum temporale and V5. So what is classically considered as the auditory motion center and the visual motion center. And using DTI here, so diffusion imaging, what Anne demonstrated is that it is likely, actually, it's DTI, right? So it's not an ultimate proof. We need to go to postmortem or animal studies for that. But at least, you know, using this statistical modelization combined with diffusion imaging, we can find reliable evidence for direct connection between these two regions. Actually, we replicated the existence of this track in a much larger sample from the Human Connectome project, and we're able to find this region. If you go to the paper, we have a series of control analyses to show that this connection seems to be very specific between these two regions, and not, for example, between the planum temporale and FFA, for example. So what we have seen is that there is auditory information, at least in V5, right? So that there is intrinsic, and what I suggest is that there is intrinsic link between the auditory motion network and visual motion network, because they share this common goal of processing the direction of motion information. So the question now is, what would happen to this system if we deprive it from one input? So for example, you remove vision. This model suggests that there will be a preferential invasion of the visual motion system by the auditory moving information, right? So Jeren, in my group, did exactly this experiment, actually following experiments done previously by Julia Dormal, and she basically showed that showed auditory motion direction and auditory space. Also, I'll focus more here on directional motion. And she presented in very similar fashion these moving sounds. First, at the univariate level. So when we contrast auditory motion versus auditory static in sighted controls, here I threshold my map a little bit lower to see the full extent of these regions. So we again see the planum temporale, which is nice to see, replicates completely independent group here, is this region that we call MTA, right? In the occipitotemporal region, middle occipitotemporal regions, we have this cluster of auditory motion processing. So kind of replication of what we have seen before. And now what is happening in the blind group when we do the same contrast, motion versus static? What you see actually is a, I'm sorry about that, I just have to plug the power on my computer. Yeah. What you see is actually an extension of this network, right? So if I switch back again, right, this is what's happening in the sighted, and it's happening what is in the blind. And what you see is that this extension is not stochastic, right? It's not random. It's really like if the network that we see in the sighted people is kind of extended posteriorly in blind people. Actually, if we contrast the two groups, what we see is that again, there are these zones of overlap where you see auditory motion selectivity in both groups. Here, by the way, in white is an outline of a visual motion localizer done in an independent sighted groups. And what you see is that there is an extension. What is in red is what is selective to auditory motion in the conjunctival blind only, right? So it seems that there is kind of an extension of the network that is already somehow present in the sighted individuals. If you now move to a more multivariate framework, and that we locate the planum temporale and V5 again independently. So first here using neurosynth, and we decode auditory directions, right? So it's not just only motion versus static, but it's like decoding the direction of auditory motion, up, down, left, right, okay? What we see is a very interesting pattern, right? So first, we see that, again, in some cases, we can decode in both the sighted and the blind. Red are sighted, blue are blind, right? In MT, okay? But that when you look at PIT, and this is extended, it seems, at least in the right side, in blind people compared to sighted people. But when you look in the planum temporale, we see the reverse pattern. So actually, you see this V shape, this actually a significant interaction between the decoding of auditory direction in both groups and both regions. So basically, you have enhanced decoding of auditory motion in V5 in blind people that goes hand by hand with a reduced decoding of this auditory motion direction in the planum temporale. Like if there was a game of balance, the reduction, the enhancement, sorry, of the computation of V5 for auditory motion seems to trigger a reduction of the involvement of the typical regions in the temporal cortex involved in this ability. So here again, we start with this model. I've shown that if in blind people, at least I've suggested that there is a preferential invasion of V5 by auditory motion. Now I can exactly do the reverse with Connect deaf people, right? We remove auditory input, and the model suggests that the human plan temporale, because it is connected with V5, will be selectively recruited for visual motion. So this is a recent experiment that Stefania Benetti did, that we published actually this year, where presented different type of information. Here we wanted to present, for some reason, visual information in the visual periphery of deaf people, where plasticity has been shown to be the strongest. And here the task of the participants was to detect which of these two panels was moving faster. And we have different type of motion direction. Previously it was lateral motion. Here it's approaching motion. Here is stochastic motion now. So we have different type of motion, and the participants needed to discriminate which motion was somehow like moving faster. And actually we used a staircase procedure inside the scanner to also ensure that there will be no difference in behavior between deaf and hearing participants. So adjusting the difficulty level somehow inside the scanner using a staircase method. And when we isolate what is active for visual motion in hearing people, now you are expecting those maps. The hotspot is located here in the middle occipital gyrus, basically V5, right? And some parietal region. Now look what's happening in deaf subject. You have these same regions, and now you see an additional spot, right? And where is this spot when you contrast the two groups? So what is more active for visual motion in deaf versus hearing participants? You have these regions selectively, and these regions overlap with the human planum temporale that is defined by an auditory motion localizer in a separate group of hearing individuals. So again, an overlap between visual motion selectivity in deaf people and auditory motion selectivity in hearing people. And when we do connectivity between this reorganized region in deaf people, to which region this region is more connected in deaf people than compared to hearing people, we see enhanced connectivity with V5. Okay, again suggesting that probably there is a transfer of information between these two connected regions. And when you remove the feed-forward input that is dominant in one region, here auditory input in the planum temporale, this region then gets preferentially invaded by the modality, the preserved modality in a functionally selective fashion, right? So here, motion. And if we decode now, so first univariate analysis, then again multivariate analysis. Here what we decode is the different direction of motions again, right? Like you have seen, there were like stochastic motion, approaching, receding, left versus right. So this different type of motion direction. What we see is that in the planum temporale, here you have enhanced and significant decoding of the visual motion direction, right? That is not here in hearing controls. And yeah, I forgot to say, but in this experiment, we also include a group of hearing controls using sign language, right, to control for the use of sign language, right? So it seems that these effects, and this is true for the one I've shown you before, are selective to deafness, or triggered by deafness, and not by the use of sign language, because it's not there in hearing control using sign language. Some of them are what we call CODA, children of deaf adults, with therefore a first language being sign language. And when we look now what is happening in V5, so the region that typically code for visual motion, obviously here we have very strong, extremely significant decoding of visual motion, right? But here again, what we see is that the trend is that it's less in early deaf compared to the hearing controls. So again, creating this interaction between enhanced decoding in the planum temporale and reduced decoding in V5. Again, like if this enhancement of the recruitment of the temporal region here in deaf people goes hand by hand by a reduction of the involvement or the computational load of the regions that typically do the job. For example, V5 here. Now I've used like one system, motion, right, as a perceptual ability. Would this idea or this model hold true if we were to go with other perceptual abilities? And here, for example, looking more, narrowing down more what we call typically the ventral stream in the occipital cortex, so regions that typically code for different visual categories, right? So V5 was probably more what we call typically a more dorsal ability, and here it's a more ventral ability. And so we will see if this idea holds true also with these different perceptual abilities. So again, classical model, if you see an audiovisual object, like for example, a human, right? Human face going with a vocalization, like for example, the expression of fear, for example, here. The idea, classical idea is that you will have processing of this information in the visual system and visual networks separated from auditory networks. Obviously, what the multisensory field proposes is that there will be strong interaction between these networks. And what we are interested in particularly is to see if we can find trace of auditory information in the VOTC of our participants. So basically showing that these regions that are typically considered as purely visual are actually more multisensory than previously considered. And again, like here, the model will be that if it is the case also, if you deprive the system from vision, there will be a preferential invasion of this region following a categorical organization that is linking these different systems, like again, functionally specific or functionally meaningful cross-modal plasticity. So Stefania in my lab did this study involving like 16 people involved in a visual experiment, 17 congenitally blind involved in an auditory experiment, and another group of 17 sighted individuals involved in an auditory experiment. She presented different categories of information, right? And she presented these different categories either in vision or audition, right? So the structure of the experiment is very similar in both modalities, right? But either you present images of some categories, like for example, animals, humans, manipulable objects, either visually or auditorily, right? So the sounds of these objects. We will look at the VOTC, right? The region that we know is involved in categorizing this information in vision. And the first thing we will do is very simple. We'll do a winner-take-all map, right? So we will, for example, here, limit ourselves to 4 categories: animals, humans, manipulable objects, or big non-manipulable objects that we know are coded separately in the visual brain, right? And show these maps of these voxels that prefer each of these categories, right? So if you do that in vision, you have these classical maps. Nothing surprising here. It's nice to see it works. In the medial regions, you have a preference in the hippocampal regions for big non-manipulable objects. When you move a little bit more laterally, you start to see face selective or human selective regions surrounded by animals, okay, here. And you move a little bit more laterally again and more dorsal, and you start to see selectivity for small manipulable objects, right? So this is a classical organization of the visual cortex that we see in vision. Nothing surprising here. Now, obviously, what is interesting is like looking at these regions when we process sounds. And first we do it in sighted, in audition, right? And you see that even if the correspondence between these two maps is obviously not perfect, right? You see actually that there is an organization that is somehow similar. You still see the medial regions that prefer the sounds of big manipulable objects. You move laterally, it starts to prefer humans and humans. And then again, a little bit more laterally here, you start to see manipulable object. Actually, if you correlate these two maps compared to a Monte Carlo permutation of these maps, you actually see that there is a significant correlation, right? If this activity was random, right, there will not be this correlation. But we see that this correlation is actually highly significant. Now, is this because when we hear the sounds of object as a sighted subject, we do visual imagery, and therefore we create a correspondence between these two maps? Well, it's actually also the case in consciously blind people, which obviously do not do visual imagery, right? You also have a correspondence between the structure of the maps that you observe in consciously blind subject and the one you observed in vision in sighted individuals. Again, medial region preferring big non-manipulable objects. Then you move to human information, here voices, and then you move again more laterally and you see manipulable objects. Interestingly enough here, I don't have time to insist on that, there is almost no animal selectivity. In the paper, actually, if you're interested, we explain maybe why we don't see that. But anyway, for at least these other three categories, there is a very nice correspondence. And actually, if anything, the correlation between the auditory map and the visual map is stronger with consciously blind compared to sighted people. Now what we can do, because we have all these categories, is actually do binary decoding of these categories, right? And we create vectors, basically, of how much distant are these two categories, are these pairwise categories, right? So it's vector of the distance in a representational space, assessed, probed here by decoding of different information, right? So the lower the decoding, the closer the representation in the brain. The higher the decoding, the more distant are the representation. And we do that in VOTC and in the early visual cortex as a control region. And what we can see is that, as expected, if we do it in vision in sighted individual, we have 50% is chance level. We have very, very significant, very distant from chance decoding of visual categories. Okay, nothing surprising. Here, actually, this is interesting. When we decode the auditory categories in the early visual cortex of either in orange blind people, in audition, obviously, and sighted people here in blue in audition, in the early visual cortex, we can decode these auditory categories only in the early visual cortex of blind people. Actually, Petra has a nice paper, I think last year, showing something similar, right? And when we look in VOTC, and here this is something interesting here, right? First, the decoding accuracy increase in blind people. It's extremely significant in blind people, right? But it's also significant in sighted people, right? So we can decode here auditory categories in VOTC of sighted people, right? Much more strongly than what we can do in EVC. So the next question is, now, what about the representational structure, right? So what do I mean by that? So here we have a vector of decoding accuracy. Like I said, like the higher, the more distinct the representation, the lower, the closer the representation. So basically they actually form a vector of the representational space that is embedded in VOTC in these different groups, right? Now we can actually represent them in terms of dissimilarity matrices, like or close or distance are two different categories. And then this forms a structure. And these structures, actually, we can correlate them again, right? And what we see is that, again, this is very significantly correlated, right? That the structure of these dissimilarities are correlated between audition and vision in sighted and blind subject, right? Actually, the correlation is typically higher between the sighted in vision and the early blind in audition compared to the other group, but it's significant in all the groups. This does not tell us what is represented in this region. So what Stefania did is she used representational similarity analysis to create models of how this information we presented is represented. So basically, first, she just asked the participants to rate behaviorally the similarity between the sounds or the visual input that we provided, what we call the behavioral dissimilarity matrix. It's basically how we organize things, right? And she contrasted that with low-level models. In vision, it's the HMAX model, which represents low-level vision. It's a computational model about low-level vision, somehow, and a pitch model that we know actually works very well to represent what is happening in the primary auditory cortex, for example, right? And when we correlate these models with the brain representation elicited by all different stimuli in all three groups, right, we can see actually if these regions correlate more to a higher level model, a behavioral model, or a lower level model, which is based on low-level properties or images or sounds. And when we do that in EVC, interestingly enough, I mean, this is again a replication of previous works, but we see that the HMAX model explained better the representational structure than the categorical model. When you go in VOTC, you see a beautiful flip, right? VOTC represents information as we perceive it behaviorally, but not as this computational model of low-level vision does it, right? So there is really this distinction between EVC and VOTC. Now let's look at what's happening for sounds in EVC. Actually, in EVC, so V1, let's say, there's no correlation with any of these models. And interestingly enough, in VOTC, there are two models that correlates with, two representations that correlates with models. It's the representation of blind people correlates with the behavioral models, and representation of sighted people again correlate with the behavioral models. No correlation with the pitch models. So what seems to be represented in VOTC of blind and sighted subject processing sound is exactly what is represented in VOTC of sighted subject processing images, really suggesting this correspondence of structural information or computation in the regions of these two groups. I'll go quickly to that. I see the time is passing very, very fast. So here actually we do also kind of what we call representational connectivity analysis. So it's actually probably difficult to explain it in few seconds, but we correlate the representational structures of different regions in the brain, probing as seeds region the VOTC, right, of different groups. And basically what we see is that the connectivity structures of these regions is very similar in sighted people processing vision compared to sighted people processing audition or blind people processing audition, right? So there is again a very strong correlation between actually here the connectivity fingerprints of these regions. Again, suggesting that maybe, at least this is what we believe, this maintenance of computational organization is linked to the connectivity structure of these regions. Now I'll zoom in one category, because here I presented different categories, but one of the category we presented were faces and voices, faces in vision, voices in audition. And actually this is very nice to see actually, if you just zoom in one category. Here in orange, I outline face selective regions with this winner-take-all approach in sighted individual. And here in yellow, what you see is the preferential activity for voice compared to all other categories in sighted people, or voice compared to all other categories in blind people. And you see a very, very nice overlap, actually, between the regions that prefer voices in sighted and blind people and the regions that prefer faces in these groups, right? Again, showing this level of functional correspondence. And obviously, face and voice goes together because from many, many activities in our daily life, like extracting speech, gender, emotions, trustworthiness, many things you extracted from the face and the voice of the people you have in front of you together, right? So there is a link between what we believe is face and voice selective regions. We have seen that seems to be the case in the occipital cortex of blind people, that voice selectively recruits face selective regions. So again, we can ask the same question. Would in deaf people, therefore, voice selective regions prefer faces with this model? So this is a study actually we did a few years back, again with Stefania Benetti. We presented very simple stimuli again, faces and houses that were matched for low-level attributes like contrast and spatial frequencies, as you see in these images. And when we asked the question, which region is more active in the chronically deaf people compared to hearing people? Again, here, hearing people either with sign language or without sign language, right? We see one region in the brain, here in the temporal cortex, that seems to prefer faces. So each dot is an individual here again. They prefer faces versus houses. It's not the case in the hearing control, hearing signers. It's only the case in early deaf people that there is this region. And again, these regions overlap with the regions that we isolate with a voice localizer in an independent group. And in this study, It's not always the case in our studies, but at least in this study, there was a correlation between this level of activity in deaf people and performance in a face discrimination task. We actually show, using an adaptation design, I will not go into too much detail here, that this region is not only react more to faces over houses, but actually can differentiate different faces, like FFA does, by using an adaptation design where we contrast blocks of different faces versus blocks of same faces. And using an MEG experiment, we show that the reactivity of these face selective regions in the temporal cortex of deaf people activates few milliseconds, again, after the activity in VOTC. So suggesting, again, probably a direct transfer of information between these two regions, direct transfer of information that we believe is accomplished by, again, functionally specific tracks that link functionally selective regions dedicated to the same process. Actually, the group of von Kriegestein in Germany already demonstrated the existence of this track, linking selectively TVA, so the temporal voice area, and FFA, right? We reproduce this finding and extend it to the deaf people to show that this track actually also exists in deaf people. If what we assume here is that this is the track that is used to create this preferential remapping of faces and voices in either the TVA or FFA of blind or deaf people. So here I'm just like take the occasion in the last 2-3 minutes to potentially anticipate a question, right? Because what I've shown here, it works apparently nicely, but last week, Marina Bedny gave this talk in this seminar series, so I think I could not really, I attended the talk, very, very nice talk, very interesting, very coherent work. But she was somehow suggesting something different, right? So she was suggesting that actually the occipital cortex switch function, right? And she used eye-level cognition as a model, right, to do that, because if the occipital cortex involved in language processing or arithmetic processing, in our interpretation, it means that the occipital cortex therefore need to switch computation. What actually, I mean, we did some of these studies. We actually also have a study where we show that we can track the rhythm of speech, meaningful speech in the primary visual cortex of blind people. But actually, what is interesting is that you can also do that in sighted people. You can track the rhythm of auditory, non-presented auditory speech from lip reading in sighted hearing people, right? And in the case, so there are also other works that show that, for example, the VWFA is not only an orthographic system, but it involves also in processing spoken language, for example, right? So maybe this is what explains also why language will recruit this region, this occipital region in blind people, because actually this is not that surprising. This information might already be there, right? And in the case of arithmetic, we also did this study with Virginie, where we contrasted subtraction operation with multiplication operation. I don't go into the detail. What we see is that there is a network of region that is selective for multiplication in both groups, right? A network of region that is selective for subtraction over multiplication, more dorsal region, and regions selectively reorganized for subtraction in blind people, right? That overlap with the right dorsal stream here. Actually, the group of Marina, we very nicely shared the map of their activity with us very nicely. And what we see is that we find basically the same region as they find, right? There is a very huge overlap between the region they find for subtraction selectivity. They compare it to language, we compare it to multiplication, right? So a very, very nice overlap. But because we have this comparison between subtraction and multiplication, so in both cases, manipulation of symbolic information linked to numbers, we think actually there is something specific about subtraction. And what we believe is specific about subtraction is the instantiation of spatial processing. Lots of work shows that actually, and that it's why actually it recruits the right dorsal stream selectively, because the right dorsal stream actually is involved in auditory spatial processing in blind people, right? As we can see here. So again, our take about that, and I think it's very interesting to think about it and debate about it and have contrasting perspective about it. But our take on that, at least, is that, again, even for the case of high-level cognition, like arithmetic or speech, what is happening in the occipital cortex of blind people is that there is an extension of something that we can already observe somehow in sighted individuals. So I'll finish with this slide. So I started with Plato, and I'll finish with Plato. So there is this cave allegory, right, that we probably all know about Plato. And I think that when you look at cross-modal plasticity, right, the first thing that the people in the cave may think about is that it's an expression of nurture, right? It's a beautiful demonstration that the brain can change itself due to experience, because these regions, for example, the occipital cortex of blind people, they start to react to non-visual information or sounds, for example, right? So obviously experience shaped the way the brain tuned to information. And this is true, we observe it. But behind the scene, maybe what's happening is that there is an innate structure that still constrains the expression of this cross-modal plasticity, right? And that this cross-modal plasticity actually, even if the regions enhance its tuning to non-visual information in case of blindness or visual information in the temporal cortex of deaf people, still there is a link toward the innate functional determination of these regions, potentially due to the connectivity scaffolding that brain networks have innately. So I think I've said that, right? So cross-modal plasticity is constrained. It changed the weight, but maybe keep its function, its role, and that there is a large-scale redistribution of computation, as we have seen this game of balance between enhancement and reduction of computation of the deprived and non-deprived region. So I'll finish by first thanking all my collaborators on these difficult studies, because these studies, they are not only technically challenging, but they involve testing blind and deaf people, and people that do that know how complex that could be. And we have done these studies in Italy and in Belgium, and we have been fortunate to receive funding for such a work. And obviously I'll finish by thanking you all for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier. This was an absolutely fascinating talk, a beautiful collection of really, really cool studies. If anybody has a question, please unmute yourself and get the debate started. Wonderful work, Olivier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra.
Everyone's so silent. I'll start with something.
Yes, please.
Beautiful talk and beautiful work, Olivier, of course. I do have a small question about the redistribution of effort between the different sensory cortices with relation to the computation. I'm curious, to what degree do you find this redistribution because the tasks are relatively easy, and maybe if you had harder tasks, the blind would show a behavioral benefit and recruit both cortices and decode the information to the same degree? So how do these behavioral and additional spread of information over cortex play out?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a good point. We typically use very, very easy tasks in the scanner to really try to trigger the clearest perception and representation of information, like, for example, in terms of direction, for example, and to really have a reliable signal. And therefore, the task is easy somehow. And so therefore, it typically do not correlate with behavior, because behavior is at sailing, for example, or it's like not really designed to be correlated with brain activity. So therefore, maybe, yeah, you are right. Maybe if the task was actually more complex, then we would not see this balance. Maybe both regions. I mean, there are propositions also there, right? You know them, that actually also intramodal plasticity might also serve behavioral compensation in sensory deprived individuals. But yeah, I don't know that. I mean, for a more broader perspective, I'm sure you have tried to link brain and behavior. It's a very tricky, tricky goal, I think, because a perceptual process is so much various, right, from the moment you involve into that it involves so many brain networks, right, that needs to work together, that isolating a complex output, like for example, sound location, for example, right, which, I mean, you can think it's simple, it's a very complex process, with one region, right, is very tricky, because just this behavior, this ability relies on many types of computation distributed across the brain. So isolating it to one region is very difficult. And so I think people are thinking now, and at least this is what we are trying to do also, it's not only looking at the activity in one region, but more in a consortium of regions together, and link that to behavior. And then maybe actually, if I link that to your question, maybe if actually I look at it together, temporal and occipital, this is what will maybe correlate the best with the behavior. We tried that, to admit, for example, with auditory motion processing, did not work, but again, for the reason I mentioned, is probably that the task was too easy.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Olivier, it's Marina.
Hello.
That was a gorgeous talk. I'm a big fan of your work, so that was super interesting. I have, as you can imagine, a million questions. I'm going to start with one. So, you know, one of the things that we see and other people have seen when analyzing resting state data is if you just kind of do the most simple analysis and you ask, what is more, you know, you take any visual region you want and you say, what is this region more correlated with in the blind population than in the sighted population? And what you find is frontal areas and also parietal areas. You know, other people have shown in other data sets, every single data set, we now have a bunch of resting state data with, you know, lots and lots of people. So these effects are very reliable, but of course they're resting state data. So my question to you is like, what do you make of that? And, you know, there's this kind of conundrum in the literature, as you know, of some of the so-called connectivity analyses are done using effective connectivity, that is taking task-based data and asking like about correlation differences across conditions. And then we have these resting state data. So what do you make of that effect? How do you put all of this kind of data together?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good question. Also, I think I'll try to do point by point, because there are several angles I could take to answer this question, I think. So first, the very reliable results that you actually have shown that, you know, yes, there is this enhanced connectivity between occipital and frontal regions, for instance, in blind people compared to sighted. This is interesting, but again, I'm not sure this is unique to the blind, right? It's extended in the blind, right? Surely, but I'm not sure it's not there in the sighted, right? So it might well be that this connection exists, right, between frontal and occipital region. Actually, we know that there is a fasciculus linking frontal and occipital regions, and that this fasciculus could be used to, again, like extend the computation. And maybe this fasciculus in sighted people is used actually to also like transfer visual information for linguistic processing purpose or these things. So that being said, it's a bit, I think resting state processing is a tricky animal. So what do I mean by that? Is that one of the most reliable finding in the literature of blind people is this reduction of connectivity between occipital regions and temporal region of the somatosensory system, right? So you have this reduced connectivity at rest, which is, when you think about it, pretty puzzling, right? Because if there is something, if in each time you seems to that blind people are involved in an auditory or tactile task, it seems to recruit these regions, right? So one thing that when starting about this, we were a little bit puzzled about that. And so what we did in one study, it's the first author is Pellan, if you're interested, is in neuroimage a few years ago. We contrasted resting state connectivity with task-based connectivity. So how does connectivity change while you are at rest or when you are involved in a task. And what we see actually in this paper is that indeed at rest, the occipital cortex of blind people is less connected with temporal or somatosensory system, right? But as soon as the blind and the sighted people engage in the task, so process information, it flips. Actually, it seems that you have cross-modal inhibition in the sighted. So like if the sighted were somehow like reducing the correlation between these two systems, right? And in the blind, it increases, right? So if when they are engaged in the task, this information transfer start to be enhanced. So what does that mean? I don't know. Actually, in the paper, we go in a kind of funny interpretation about the fact that the occipital cortex of blind people is, to some extent, more a multi-dimensional system that could switch from tasks and at several angles. But what do I mean by that is that it seems that also when we analyze the variability of the signal in the occipital cortex at rest of blind people, it's more variable, right? So that there is like more this variability, and that sometimes this occipital cortex might connect to some region and in another moment to other region, right? And that at rest, this switch of connectivity is higher in blind than in sighted subject. I don't know exactly what does that mean, but I think it's interesting to think about it, at least in the context of the fact that maybe resting state connectivity might not necessarily be the best technique to infer function, right? It is a useful technique, I'm sure, right? I mean, I know also all the works that link functional modularity that you can capture with rest at rest, and the one that you can capture when you do a task. But I think there is also rooms for differences. And again, like what will be interesting also, and that we are trying to think about, is also linking this different type of connectivity, like you mentioned, right? So resting state, directional connectivity, functional connectivity, structural connectivity, and see actually if they link or not and how they differ. I understand my answer was not perfectly explaining you to the point. I think it's complex. I think it's a complex question. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Olivier, I agree with you. It's complicated, and it's not that anybody really knows what these signals mean. That said, I would say the decrease in connectivity between auditory areas and somatosensory areas and visual cortex, and the increase with prefrontal and parietal areas makes perfect sense under the account that these regions are getting their information mostly top down. So one could, it doesn't make any sense on one account and it makes sense on the other account. But I agree with you, resting state data, we actually don't have very good connectivity measurements right now in all of these. It's complicated. So I totally agree with you.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
I wanted to ask a quick question, follow up the connectivity. This is Yuchi, I'm a postdoc with Ella. So did you ever find any correlation between any connectivity, either DTI or resting state, the correlation between the strength of connectivity and the extent of cross-modal plasticity?
Good point. Yeah, good question also. Did we do that? You mean, yeah, what we have done and some of the work I've shown is that when we do functional connectivity analysis, so basically we implement it with PPI, for example, psychophysical interactions. I don't know if you're familiar with, but so it's task-based connectivity, right, where you contrast the connectivity between two states, right, two tasks, for example. And what we see is that indeed you have enhanced connectivity in the deprived individuals, so for example, in blind people, between, for example, V5 and the planum temporale when they process motion versus when they process static. And reversely, in deaf people, when they process visual motion, there is enhanced connectivity between the planum temporale and V5 when they process motion compared to when they process static information, right? So there is this enhanced connectivity during the task, but does that answer your question? I'm not sure if your question was like, would I find trace of enhanced connectivity at rest? And would that link to the expression of cross-modal plasticity, or I mean, I don't know, actually.
Yeah, like for example, whether the strength of DTI, like white matter connectivity between V5 and PT correlate with like cross-modal plasticity in that sense, more of a structural connectivity.
Yeah, so it's also a good question. At rest, no, we actually never investigated that, to be honest. What we did recently is actually we have this extension of this study, the study I presented of JEREN, where we have this decoding of auditory motion in V5 of blind people that is extended. We have actually also DTI data on these people. So we were able to, again, like do this DTI work on linking V5 and PT, right, plan temporale. And what we could see is that the strength, if you want, of the existence of this connection was similar between the two groups, so not enhanced in one or the other. But when you go to more like, like microstructural measures like FA or FD or, then it's reduced in blind people. I have really hard time also really linking that. I mean, I think most of the field really like understanding what is the meaning of this functional anisotropy or diffusivity or presence of potential crossing fibers in these tracks. And yeah, what we see is that it is reduced in deaf and blind people, these micro measurements, but the strength of the track itself is not very different. Again, and we rely on that to say that the track is there, it's pretty stable, it's altered, right? Probably at some level it's altered, but it's not that the track disappear, right? It's the occipital cortex still connect to other regions in a functionally meaningful fashion. Yeah, I see another question from Yunfei.
Hello, I'm Yunfei, a PhD student working with Marina. So I'd like to learn more about your interpretation of that scale that you say, that increase and decrease of visual and audio thing, because my understanding is that like in deaf people, the region for visual direction is still working, but they have their region for auditory direction also working to interpret visual direction. If that's the case, what is decreased? I think they have this increased activation. I cannot get what is decreased.
Yeah. It's a good point. Maybe it was not very clear. So at the univariate level, we don't see much of a difference, right? So if we do, and this is probably why most of the previous work did not really highlight this fact. So at the univariate level, right, we do not see a decrease in any other regions. What we see is an increase of the temporal cortex, and more precisely the temporal cortex for visual motion processing, right? The decrease we see is when we use multivariate decoding analysis, right? When we attack the more fine-grained representation that is embedded in the region. So not processing motion, if you want, but then processing the direction of motion. To go to this level of information, you cannot do that using univariate analysis, because at the univariate level, there's no difference between these different things. You need to use the distributed pattern of activity. When you decode these different directions of motion, there, what you see is a reduction in deaf people in V5, right? So the regions that typically implement this process, right, mostly, not only, but mostly implement this process, seems to decode less. So I have a more loosey, somehow like an information representation. And because it is simultaneous to the fact that PT increases its decoding, what I infer from that, but really it's pure inference here, right? I don't have a very clear demonstration of that. It's just like, it's concomitant, right? But it's that these two things are linked, right? That somehow like the extension of PT for visual motion processing in the deaf reduce the computational load that you observe in V5. Like because these two regions are connected, like a communicating vase principle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like basically you need to process the information. The valves are open because you do not have feed forward auditory input, right? So this link actually is open, more open, and then therefore that the computation redistributes between the two regions.
I see. So the decrease is in terms of decoding accuracy relative to sighted people.
Exact.
Okay, thank you.
Contrasted to hearing people, because it's the deaf.
Hearing, yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Olivier, since nobody else is asking questions, I'll just keep going.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to get a better idea of your thoughts about the math stuff. So you found this difference between subtraction and multiplication, and actually, of course, I don't know if I'm sure Shabro is here. I don't know if she's here anymore, but of course, people have talked about the fact that for multiplication, at least for small numbers or for many numbers, it's a memorization-based process and not even really like a working memory or a quantity-based process. So for sure, it's a different sort of thing. And, the DeHaan group and various others, Piazza, have shown these kinds of differences between. So that's fine. But I guess my question to you is like, what's your prediction, right? Because of course there's evidence for quantity-based effects in parietal cortex, and these math-based effects are like larger responses to difficult math equations with larger numbers for in blind people in visual cortex, and in sighted people and blind people in parietal cortex, that they don't lend themselves very naturally to a spatial account. But more interestingly, I'm kind of just curious about your predictions. Like, what do you think ought to activate this part of the visual cortex in blind people, and what ought not to with relation to math, so that we can do those experiments and settle this once and for all?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure I have the answer to that, but yeah, I mean, I'm very, where I come from, right? I come really from the sensory, I started doing very, very simple sensory experiments. So I cannot refrain myself to think like this. So I still believe that indeed, in these very complex computations like arithmetic processing with large numbers or whatever, you kind of need to ground it to a more prehensible computation, like, for example, organize this in space, right? So classical snark effect, operational momentum effect, so more linked to here arithmetic. If you do a subtraction, as you know, your attention moves toward the left. If you do an addition, it moves toward the right. You process information faster on the right side after doing a multiplication. You process faster information on the left side after doing a subtraction, for example. So there is this kind of movement in your mind, right, on kind of a mental whiteboard that is spatially organized. When you do subtraction, therefore, what I believe is that you engage these type of processing, right? So therefore you engage somehow under the ground without seeing it spatial processing, right? And because you engage spatial processing, this is why you recruit the right dorsal stream, right? Even in your studies, right? When you contrast language with math, it's typically more on the right side for math and more dorsal. For language, it's more on the left side, at least in the Kanija study, right?
Not for the verbal math equations, really. I mean, it in the occipital cortex, it was actually on the right, but in the parietal cortex, it's kind of bilateral. But anyway, I mean.
Yeah, Okay, I mean, I look further into that, but still my take on that is that maybe there is this link, right? There is this link, and like you say, multiplication, at least in the way we implemented it, was very easy. I mean, not that easy, but still easy. It's more probably memory retrieval. And therefore it engaged different circuits. I think it's a little bit the same principle as what you do when you do math versus language, right? So you want to take two abilities and see if they actually locate in different places of the occipital cortex in a relevant fashion, which you demonstrate, right? You demonstrate that maths goes somewhere, language goes somewhere else, right? Which obviously needs, and you say that obviously that there is a structure there, right? It's not stochastic, right? It's not that in one subject it goes there, in another it goes elsewhere. It seems that there is at least a minimum level of coherence inter-subject in the way these processes are remapped in the occipital cortex. So it needs that there is a structure. Structure is connectivity, but for both of us, you with high-level regions, me too, but maybe for different reasons, right? Or high and low, is because they share a computation that is maybe grounded on space, for example, right? The parietal cortex is obviously a highly spatial region, right? And this is not surprising to see it engage in arithmetic processing when the arithmetic engage these processes. The fact that you can, so this is why we use multiplication. We use multiplication because it has the same symbols, right? We use the same symbolic information. So we thought it was kind of a better control of language, right? Because we still have these symbolic numbers that we need to manipulate in our mind. We just need to do a different operation on them. One that we believe involves space, one that we believe involves memory. And when it involves space, it recruits, in our case, the right dorsal stream, which I think it's interesting. Then, yeah, how can I explain the fact that, yeah, that other region would involved in different other tasks? Yeah, I guess at one point I have to admit that it's not the whole story, I guess, but yeah, I would still be curious. What I invite you at least to consider is to see if you can find a link between the regions you see reliably activated and somehow the potential hidden computation that is engaged in these other tasks.
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, you know, it's more like assume the link, right? So I feel like after the fact, you could say, look, it's spatial, but you know, and then I'm going to assume that there's a common computation. And so whenever I find an effect, I'm going to try to think about like, well, what's a possible, but the problem is like, that's a pretty unconstrained process. So I think if we want to like resolve the issue, we need to make some predictions.
I agree with you. I think it goes both ways, right? Because the reverse is true also. I could reverse the argument. And then, yeah, we should think hard on how to really disentangle that, right? To make the hypothesis falsifiable, right? Basically, basic, you know, epistemology of science here.
Thank you very much again, Olivier. I think we should wrap up unless anybody else has a really pressing question. I, of course, have a lot of questions, but I think in the interest of time, we should probably finish the discussion. But thank you so much, everybody also for contributing. And thank you so much, Olivier, for a wonderful talk. And I think I'll hand over to Stephanie.
Yes, thank you, Olivier. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Emma, for helping us with all of this. And I hopefully see you next week when we have Babbage and Cunningham.